Hi, I'm Cassie Haley. I'm here with Jennifer Kefer. She is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Industrial Efficiency. Thanks for joining me. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Alliance actually is?
Absolutely. Thanks, Cassie. The Alliance for Industrial Efficiency is a diverse coalition of business, contractor, labor, and environmental groups who are committed to finding ways to increase deployment of combined heat and power. And we do that with work both on the state level, working on policy, and also on federal level as well. And we do education.
All right. Well, educate me right now. What are standby rates?
Absolutely. So from the very launch of the Alliance, every time I talk to folks about barriers to combined heat and power and to waste heat to power, I hear them talking about standby rates. But we never really had anything that kind of quantified what this barrier really was. And so recently the Alliance has tried to do a lot more work on standby rates to try to figure out can we put any teeth on this? What exactly is a standby rate and how much of a barrier does it impose to a project? A standby rate is effectively an insurance policy for a CHP system. At its core, a CHP host is basically becoming a mini distributed power plant. You're producing both heat and electricity on site, and you're no longer as dependent on the grid. But occasionally, you do need to access grid power, maybe because you're not producing all of your electricity, so you need supplemental power, or because you have a planned outage, or less common, because you have an unplanned, unexpected outage. But in all of those instances, you have a standby rate so that the grid will be on standby to provide the electricity in the event that you need it.
Okay. So what are some of the best practices when it comes to standby rates?
So there are kind of best practices in the abstract, and thankfully we've been able to witness or observe some of these best practices in our analysis as well. As I said, we want to try to really get down in the weeds about standby rates and learn a little bit more about how they're affecting potential CHP hosts. And so we've looked at 12 utilities across 4 states in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Minnesota. And we've seen many worst practices and a handful of best practices. Interestingly, those utilities that have the best practices are also some of those that have the worst. So some best practices are providing some transparency, making sure that the rates are clear and that there's a little bit of hand-holding. Going into this, I had kind of thought that a standby rate was a single line item on your bill. It's not that at all. In the case of Duke Energy, in Ohio, there are literally 24 separate tariffs that a potential CHP host has to identify and add together to calculate their rate. That in itself is not necessarily a worst practice because there's some transparency there because you could kind of figure out if one of those tariffs is really where the problem is and take that up with the utility commission. But the best practice is what we see with AEP Ohio, which likewise has a large number of tariffs, but then has an online bill calculator. So a host is very easily able to assess what their tariffs will be, what their rates are going to be if they're to move forward with a system. Another type of best practice, and kind of on the flip side, a worse practice, is an outage does objectively impose costs on the utility. If you're providing power for my system, you should be compensated for that. A best practice is to differentiate between the time of those outages so that you're really getting compensated for the actual cost the system is imposing. So if my outage is scheduled on a cold winter's day, the hit on the electricity grid is going to be much lower than if it's in the middle of a summer afternoon. So worst practices are what we see in a number of the utilities that we've looked at. Flat fee. You have an outage. Not only are you charged a huge fee, that fee is going to be carrying out month over month. In fact, for a solid year in the case of DP&L in Minnesota. On the flip side, a best practice would be where you have an outage and you are charged based on kind of the actual cost the outage is imposing to the utility. And there's some kind of hidden incentives. If you schedule your outage and you do it in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter, the fee should be lower.
So what steps might the Alliance be taking right now to encourage that type of progression?
Great question. So right now we started really getting into the weeds. We've teamed up with an exceptional consulting firm, Five Lakes Energy, and they are the ones who are trying to translate some of these rates into plain English for us. So they're gathering the 24 tariffs for Duke Energy, trying to, one, figure out what the rates actually are, two, opening up a dialogue with the utilities themselves to make sure that we've done it right, because that's frankly part of the problem, is that it's really difficult to figure out what costs actually are. And then we're beginning to have a dialogue with the Utility Commission. So the Alliance for Industrial Efficiency has now set up stakeholder meetings where we've brought in voices from all different parts of the CHP value chain to meet with commissioners and highlight the issues around standby rates. We've also organized business letters. We think it's really important for commissioners not just to hear from a bunch of DC policy wonks, but to the folks that would actually be installing systems to be able to say, look, I would love to install a CHP system in your territory, but I can't because of the expense. And I think that business voice is really important. So we've been trying to get that voice engaged.